Test check, 1, 2, 1, 2. All righty, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Got a lot to cover tonight, hour and a half time limit. I know some couldn't join us tonight. A lot of households were sick and contacted me and told me they're going to be watching from online. Of course, we're recording as well to YouTube, so we have it available to us later if you would like to look through it. I'm going to go ahead and pray. We're going to go ahead and start. Father God, we thank you so much for this time that we could gather together. And I ask, Lord, that you would enlighten our minds, give us understanding and wisdom. Help us to know how we should conduct ourselves in terms of money and finances. Teach us what good stewardship looks like. I pray that we would be open-minded and that we would be eager to receive instruction from your word. We thank you for all that you have done for us, and we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so talking a little bit just about last time and orienting ourselves to, this whole topic in general. Again, this is the second part of a two-part series on philosophy of stewardship, and then we're also going to be talking about philosophy of service in a future session. And then we will also be looking at topics surrounding parenting, ideally, as well. And this was all instigated by the fact that we had questions in our church about whether or not we were going to spend money to hire out cleaning. We have previously had a volunteer basis cleaning service, and so that was our structure up until now. But we were having families drop off for various reasons, and we started to ask the question of whether or not it would be appropriate to instead hire this service out. And of course, there were a lot of opinions and a lot of differing opinions on whether or not this was a good move. And my contention is that the reason there were so many opinions on whether or not this was a good move is because we have different underlying philosophies of how we should be living our lives as Christians, and we are importing those upon the church. We're basically saying that the particular way in which I view Christianity and view these topics surrounding Christianity, it makes intuitive sense to me that in the church we would function the same way. But of course, not all of us have the same particular worldview when it comes to Christianity. Everybody has different shades, different nuances, especially surrounding these three topics: stewardship and service and parenting and how we should be utilizing the resources God has given us. And so that's what this is all about. We're trying to get to the root cause of this, but it's not just to answer this question. It's fantastic, I think, that God has given us, through this particular situation, the opportunity to try and examine these questions, ask these questions, and try to understand how we as Christian brothers and sisters, even though we believe differently about some of these things, might still be part of the same family of God. And so that's where we're going. Tonight is focused on philosophy of stewardship, money and assets. You're going to see some repeat themes from what we talked about when we talked about philosophy of stewardship. Time and money and assets are going to have some similarities, though some differences as well. And my hope is that by the time we're done with the series, ideally at the end of the first quarter, we will have some good answers for what we want to do as a church when it comes to this topic. So first, I want us to ask the question about stewardship. What is stewardship? We asked this question last time. I don't know if anyone remembers from last time. What is stewardship?
And stewardship is just money. Stewardship is how you handle your money, your time. I'm trying to think what else. Things that God has given to you, whether it's home or whatever. It's how you best handle, take care of it or use it.
Good. That's absolutely correct. Yeah. Sorry, there's a lot online tonight. Is it on? Did I turn it on? I thought I did, but maybe I didn't. Well, you may not be coming through the house, but it might be coming online, which is probably fine. Does it show that it's on the little plate there? And let me look. It should be on. Even if it's not coming through house, try to speak into it and see if it's not. When I talk, it bounces up, right? Up and down, and it doesn't when Liz speaks? Okay. Huh. Well, try your best. We'll continue on.
Last time you mentioned something about managing things that don't belong to you.
That's correct. We got that quote from Keith Reeves, management of resources which are not your own. Management of resources, and that goes to Shirley's point, could be any of this stuff, plus more, which are not your own. That's the key. And we noted we're being somewhat countercultural when we take this approach because there aren't very many people out there who would say that their time doesn't belong to them or their money doesn't belong to them. You talk to most people and they say, I earn my money, right? I work hard for my money. It belongs to me. I can use it as I see fit. But we as Christians believe differently. We believe that all the resources we have are entrusted to us from God, right? God gives us everything we have in terms of our time and money, and so therefore we are under obligation to utilize the time and money and assets, home, etc. We're under obligation to utilize all of it well. We will answer for how we utilize our resources, either for good or for ill. And so that's the key idea. These resources are not our own, therefore we have to ensure that we're going to be using them well. Now, like I said, tonight we're focusing on money. A friend of mine suggests I kick off with a question that might be a bit controversial, okay? And so I thought this would be a fun idea. His question was this: would Jesus use a private jet for ministry? Would Jesus use a private jet for ministry? What do you guys think? You want to say something?
No, I like the question.
Yes. Who wants to answer?
No, he wouldn't need a jet because he could go from here to there by himself.
Jesus doesn't need a jet. He can just disappear and reappear elsewhere.
Yeah. But I mean, if it was something at that time that would have been useful and would have put forth the lesson that he was trying to teach, he would have used it, I think.
Okay. Shirley
but it
says yes.
had a proper use and a proper reason to do it and not to show, I don't know, self or something like that, yeah.
Okay.
But he would need it.
Other thoughts? Would Jesus use a private jet for ministry? Okay.
He put aside all the riches of heaven, so I don't think he would want to use it just for, the comfort and the pleasure of it and the prestige of it.
So you're willing to grant he might use it, but he wouldn't be doing it because it's more comfortable to ride in a private jet or
Just to be
it's
like
more
a king,
convenient.
Yeah, to be like a king here on earth, basically. Like,
I see.
I'm gonna,
But you're willing to grant maybe. Maybe, but not for those reasons, perhaps. Or to show your money or your extravagance, right? Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? Some of you guys may or may not know that there are many, maybe not many, half dozen or so, maybe more, television evangelists and preachers who have private jets, and they're known to have private jets, and they fly around and they do ministry on that basis, right? And I think there's a fundamental reaction against these prosperity preachers, right? The prosperity preachers would say, oh yeah, right? And when they've been asked these questions on live television before, right? They're, oh yeah, Jesus would use a private jet, I use a private jet, I use it for ministry, I use it for the kingdom, I use it for God, etc. And, if you're faithful and you give and all that type of stuff, I mean, Jesus might give you a private jet too, right? And there's kind of that attitude that, money's not hard to come by, right? Like, God will bless you, And I think it's interesting. Now, are prosperity preachers, do they just don't know their Bible at all? Do they just have, no clue about the Bible?
It's really helpful if people are online.
Yeah. I think people can get caught up in having things to do what they think their job is. And if they're not careful, then it's no longer for the right motive or for the right thing, but they become used to it. And we can do the same thing with anything that we have. If it's better, then we can do a better job, we think. But it depends on what priority that takes in your mind and your purpose and your reason for doing things.
Yeah, I think that's very valuable.
Maybe it's not a matter of them knowing their Bibles, but maybe they take it out of context of what God's blessing is. So, like, you know, if he says you follow his ways and he'll make you prosperous in all you do, doesn't mean that you're going to have a private jet. Blessings are different than so.
I want to piggyback on this. This is going to be very important for tonight, which is part of why I'm asking the question. Prosperity preachers generally overemphasize the discussions of wealth in the Old Testament. Okay, that's very important to recognize. The Old Testament and the New Testament largely do not treat wealth the same. They have overlap, but they don't treat it the same. And this is something really important to recognize, okay? So you'll find a lot of prosperity preachers regularly quoting many Old Testament texts from Proverbs or the Psalms that talk about God pouring out his abundant riches and blessings and wealth if you obey him and his commands, etc. And there's a large Old Testament emphasis there, okay? Go ahead.
I was just reading in Psalms today, and it talked about blessings and everything, and it goes to the man who has his barns filled, you know, and everything's okay. Then it goes back, and the point is that is not the important thing. It's what you do for the Lord, and having your barns filled, and of course all the money or whatever you have is not the purpose.
Yeah.
I have a quick question. Maybe you said this at the beginning and I missed it, but is stewardship the actual word of stewardship in the Bible? I mean, obviously the concept of stewardship is there, but like, is there ever a time where it says like, be a good steward of,
So
that you know of?
The passages I know of it aren't didactic in this sense of like a Pauline statement like you just made, but they're more narrative when Jesus is giving parables. So he will use the Greek word for steward when he's talking about, you know, being a good steward or something like that, but it's usually in a parabolic context. I can't think of a verse, like even when you go to, say, Paul's lists of fruit of the Spirit, or, you know, the opposite of vice list when he's often listing out, you know, good virtues to have. I don't see that same word there, but I haven't done like a deep dive on that particular word. So it's a really good question. It would be an interesting word study for sure. Yeah, good question. Okay, now the reason I bring this up is there are some people who would say absolutely no, not, right? No way would Jesus ever use a private jet for ministry. And these people often come from what I would call a frugality mindset, okay? Frugality mindset that is essentially saying, you know, look, we need to ensure that we are not spending in a way that is extravagant or lavish or using our money in a fashion that we're purchasing luxury items. And a private jet could be nothing but a luxury item, and so therefore, no, there's no way Jesus would ever fly in a private jet or use a private jet for ministry. They would say something like, the preacher or the pastor ought not to have too much money. I don't know if you guys know this, but recently I was actually watching a video, and a popular evangelical preacher, it just came out that his house is valued on the market over $1 million. And there were people who were criticizing him because his house is valued over $1 million, right? And he's a very popular preacher. His church is massive. They have a multi-million-dollar budget, and his house is valued over $1 million, and there were people publicly criticizing him for this, right, along similar lines, okay? Now, I want to introduce you to a third concept. I got this idea from Dave Ramsey, and I think it's very helpful, okay? And he talks about, well, luxury or extravagance is based upon a percentage of your overall wealth, okay? Percentage of overall wealth. And he uses another analogy that I think is actually helpful to talk about this. You guys may or may not have seen this in the news about 5 years ago, but Jay-Z on his birthday went out for an extravagant night on the town, if you will. He spent over $100,000 one night on his birthday. He went out to a bar, bought everybody in the entire place champagne, right? He was running around. He left an $11,000 tip, right? And he ended up spending over $100,000 on his night out. And he was criticized largely in the culture and the society after doing this. But what I thought was so interesting is Dave Ramsey did a video on this, and it was entitled that, it was entitled, Jay-Z's Night Out Should Not Make You Mad. Okay? Jay-Z's Night Out Should Not Make You Mad. And what Dave Ramsey did in that video is he went through and he talked about Jay-Z's net worth and roughly what Jay-Z makes every single year. So at the time of the recording of the video, Jay-Z made roughly $42 million a year, okay? There you go. And as Shirley said, so $100,000, he hardly even noticed it. And what actually Dave Ramsey did in that video, he said that would be like the equivalent of one of us, standard middle-class earners, going out and spending, $500 or maybe $1,000, right? Like, it's a lot, right? But relative to overall wealth, it's not going to break the bank. It's not going to kill us, And so that's essentially what he had done, is kind of break that down. And that's why he essentially said, because Jay-Z earns that much, this was not a bad thing for him to do, right? But a lot of Christians especially were very annoyed at the time at the luxury, the extravagance, the over-the-top spending, okay? And I believe Jay-Z surpassed recently over $1 billion in net worth. I believe he's a billionaire now. So just something interesting, I think, to look at. So the idea is, I just want to throw these out there to you. You're going to want to think about these concepts and where you kind of land. When I ask if Jesus would use a private jet, when you hear that Jay-Z spends over $100,000 on a night out on his birthday, do you tend to go, oh yeah, that's perfectly fine, no problem, God lavishes blessings? Or do you tend to go, oh man, what luxury, what extravagance, that's not good stewardship, that's very poor? Or would you say, well, I need more information, I need to look at percentage overall wealth and kind of judge from there? I think all of us have a gut reaction when it comes to these things. And I want to shed light on them. Because when you hear some things like this, I think we just kind of naturally go, ugh, or we naturally go, oh yeah, that's fine. But we don't often talk about why. Like, what are the underlying reasons why this might be good in our minds or bad in our minds, okay? So that's the first thing I wanted to bring up, just opening with this idea, and I promise it's relevant for the discussion that we'll be having tonight. Now, I want to lean into something I just talked about explicitly a minute ago, and we're just going to spend a little bit of time here, and that's the differences between the Old Testament and the New Testament when it comes to discussions of wealth. The Old Testament and the New Testament actually treat wealth relatively differently. We're not going to go in depth into a whole, study into Old Testament views of wealth or New Testament views of wealth. I will stop and take some passages from each. We're going to spend some time explicitly in Proverbs to get an Old Testament sense, and then we're going to actually be looking at a parable that Jesus shares in the New Testament to get a bit of a New Testament sense. But I want you to know these views are largely different. Again, I am referencing some of Keith Reeves' work on this topic. I referenced him last time as well. He does a little course on wealth and stewardship in the Bible, and I found it very helpful, and so I just want to reference that to you. But Keith Reeves essentially says this. He says that the Old Testament view on wealth is largely positive. He says, wealth is intrinsically good, and God created a world of abundance. That's roughly the Old Testament view. If you could take all of the passages out of the Old Testament, there's some that are easier to reconcile than others, but for the most part, in the Old Testament, wealth is intrinsically good, and not only that, but God created a world of abundance, okay? The world is full of abundance. Wealth is intrinsically good, okay? How is this explicitly talked about? Well, We won't turn there, but just tell you a passage that is representative in Proverbs. This is Proverbs 12:27, okay? Proverbs 12:27 explicitly says this, whoever is slothful will not roast his game, but the diligent man will get precious wealth. The diligent man gets precious wealth. It's kind of treated like an axiom of life. Diligence leads to wealth. It's actually interesting if you read, there's a quote from John Wesley, and he talks about frugality. And he says, in any good society, the Christian people will be frugal. And then he says, which will naturally lead to wealth, right? Because they are treating their finances in a way that he thinks is essentially according to Proverbs 12:27. Whoever is slothful will not roast his game, but the diligent man will get precious wealth. That Protestant work ethic is going to lead to wealth, according to Proverbs 12:27. How is wealth attained in the Old Testament? Well, first of all, you've got to look at the way wealth was viewed, and that is primarily through the land, okay? The land is largely the form of wealth or the means of wealth in the Old Testament. And so in the Old Testament, you might not see a lot of coins being handed around, although that happens sometimes, but instead, land, livestock, all of these things are the ways that Hebrews possessed wealth. Land is a very important concept in the Hebrew Bible. It's actually, and it's a Hebrew word worth knowing because it occurs so frequently. Eretz. The word eretz occurs over 2,500 times in the Hebrew Old Testament. And the reason we want to talk about in terms of land is the poor in the Old Testament are largely those who don't own any land, okay? And there are particular laws to help the poor. These are called gleaning laws. The idea being this: your land, your eretz, produces crops, grain. When you go and harvest that, that is wealth for you, but not everybody has land, therefore they don't have crops or grain, so there are gleaning laws. And there are all these rules about how much you could take and all that type of stuff. Ruth is availing herself of some gleaning laws in the book of Ruth. It's for the poor. It's for the people who don't have land, who don't have crops or livestock, and who therefore don't have wealth. Now, that's the case for non-landowners, okay? Non-landowners in the Old Testament. Now, there's a progression throughout the Old Testament. Once you start introducing kings in the Old Testament, now we get everybody's favorite, taxation. And God explicitly warns the Hebrews about this. God says in particular, he, that is the king, will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers, right? He's trying to urge them, you don't want a king, it's not going to be fun, you're not going to like it, okay? And what do? They go ahead and say, give us a king anyway. And then there's a centralization of wealth that begins to happen with the monarchy. Okay, so you can see this progression as government comes into play and is established. You're moving from a tribal system where you have all these individuals, and now all of that wealth is being centralized underneath the monarchy. All right, so along with taxation, the centralization of government becomes an issue, and under the tribal system, look, all economic activity was essentially within the tribe, but now it is centralized, and there is a strong governmental aspect. However, there's one other aspect to wealth in the Old Testament that we need to highlight here, and that is children. Children are explicitly described as a blessing, and even a blessing of wealth from God. And there's actually a passage here that I think is representative. This is Psalm 144, 12 to 15, if you're taking notes. I'll just go ahead and read it. Psalm 144, 12 to 15. Says this, may our sons in their youth be like plants full grown, our daughters like corner pillars cut for the structure of a palace. May our granaries be full, providing all kinds of produce. May our sheep bring forth thousands and 10,000s in our fields. May our cattle be heavy with young, suffering no mishap or failure in bearing. May there be no cry of distress in our streets. Blessed are the people to whom such blessings fall. Blessed are the people whose God is the Lord. Notice that verses 13 and 14 describe all of these aspects of wealth that I just described. And verse 12 explicitly talks about sons and daughters. They're part of this wealth. They're part of this blessing from God. And so that absolutely must be recognized, especially because in our culture, in our day and age, it's not generally viewed that children are wealth. In fact, children are wealth suckers, according to our culture and society. I have a coworker who said, I don't know why you'd want to have children and spend all your money on them. I want to spend my money on myself. And now I was like, whoa, you just said that in public. Okay, right? But that was the situation, and that's how a lot of people feel these days. But in contrast to this, you can see that children are a blessing from Lord, and they are a source of wealth from the Lord, okay? Not just some, arbitrary economic burden that you have to bear, all right? There are a few Old Testament passages that are challenging when it comes to wealth. These are particularly the book of Job, okay, just navigating wealth in the book of Job. There you go. You're taking the worldly perspective, Cody. No. The book of Job, it's an investment, okay? You invest your wealth to your children, and in your old age, it's going to pay dividends. Job is a very challenging book when you look at wealth and how wealth is treated from this Old Testament perspective. Job obviously has lots of wealth. He's a wealthy figure. He loses a lot of his wealth. Then God gives him double. And then, of course, in the engagement between him and his friends, there's a lot of discussion surrounding wealth. And then, notoriously speaking, and this is just because this is a hard book in general, Ecclesiastes, right? This book, in many respects, feels to be like it's an outlier from all the rest of the Old Testament. You'll read all sorts of stuff about one topic in the Old Testament. You're like, I got it on lock. You go to Ecclesiastes, and it says the exact opposite. And you're like, I don't understand. Okay, so this is a challenging book in general. But overall, again, Old Testament puts a positive spin on wealth. Okay, wealth is good in the Old Testament, and this was my point earlier. Prosperity preachers exclusively focusing on Old Testament texts can make a strong biblical case that wealth is good, it's positive, God wants you to be wealthy, and this is a blessing from God for his faithfulness, right? Like, if you're faithful, you are going to receive a blessing of wealth from God. That's all there is to it, okay? It's very obvious if you read only the Old Testament, okay? Any questions on this? Yes? Right. Shirley said they're taking the word in a one-sided way, and blessings from God are a lot more than money. So, and I absolutely, and I think we benefit from having the whole Bible to help us come to conclusions like that. And that's where I want to go next. What's the New Testament view? Well, interestingly enough, the New Testament view is basically the opposite of the Old Testament, okay? Now, these exist on a continuum, right? So if you had a positive view over here and a negative view over here, I'm not saying that the Old Testament is 100% positive and the New Testament is 100% negative. But what I am saying is the New Testament exists right about here and the Old Testament exists right about here, right? They're at the extreme ends of the spectrum. Together they paint a fuller picture, but again, they are at the extreme ends of the spectrum.
Pastor,
Yes.
when you look at the Old Testament and you look at like Abraham and some of his people, they were very blessed with wealth. In the New Testament, who was the people he chose, his disciples? They were not from the wealthy. He chose the poor and, whatever to do his work. So you see a totally different concept or viewpoint there.
Right, especially when you look at books like Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, Paul explicitly states God did not choose the wealthy of the world, essentially, to populate his church with. Now, when you look at the apostles, we'll get to this in a little bit, but when you look at the apostles, there's a little bit of disparity there, right? So the apostles weren't all poor. Peter owned a home, okay? And James and John, their father, Zebedee, had servants. It said they explicitly left their servants behind. So you have to be somewhat wealthy to have servants. But that's kind of all the detail we get. So it seems like Jesus' apostles, some of them at least are about middle class, right? But yes, once you get into Corinthians and you start seeing the New Testament develop, you see Jesus and his followers essentially calling, the poor, the outcasts, the lame, in all of those, right, to himself. So it's very interesting to see that. Now, I don't have time to go into them. There are countless parables on wealth and riches. I'm just going to name some out of Matthew, okay? There's the parable of the moths and the thieves in Matthew chapter 6. This is, don't store your wealth on earth where rust and moth may destroy it, but store your wealth in heaven. Jesus also talks about the birds and the lilies in that chapter. This is about wealth because he's saying to not trust in your own ability to generate wealth. He actually says you're worried about a lot of things, and he says, look at the birds of the field. They don't harvest, and yet your Father in heaven feeds them. The lilies, they don't toil or spin, and yet they are clothed with more glory than even Solomon. The parable of the treasure in the field. This is the man who goes and he finds a treasure in the field, and then he digs it up, and he says, this is precious. He buries it. He goes, he sells all he has, buys the field, then goes back and digs up the treasure, right? That is partially about wealth as well. It talks about the kingdom, but it's about wealth. Right after that, the parable of the merchant man and the pearl. He's looking for the greatest pearl. He finds that pearl of great price, sells all he can to acquire it. The parable of the camel and the rich man. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter into heaven. That's explicitly about wealth and how difficult it can be to enter into heaven if you have great wealth. The parable of the householder and his servants, okay? This is in Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. That one's about wealth. 2 sons in his vineyard, and this is explicitly, this is not the prodigal son, but it's the parable of the 2 sons in the vineyard. That's in Matthew chapter 21. That one's about wealth. The householder and the heir, also in Matthew chapter 21. There are the parable of the talents. That one's pretty well known. That's Matthew chapter 25. And there's the faithful and wise servant in Matthew chapter 24. That's 10, and that's only Matthew. Okay. So there are more in Luke. There are more in Mark. The Bible has a lot to say in the New Testament specifically about wealth. And largely, there are warnings against wealth in the New Testament. There are statements like the camel going through the eye of the needle. The New Testament seems to be a little bit more negative when it comes to understanding wealth and trying to see how it fits in. Go ahead.
I was just going to comment on the parable about the camel through the eye of a needle. So Dallas Willard has a really good chapter in Spirit of the Disciplines called as Poverty Spiritual. And he talks about that parable. He talks about some other things. And that parable is often misunderstood, right? People view it as a condemnation of riches, or riches make it hard to get into heaven. But if you look at the disciples' response, it's obvious that's not what it means, right? So Jesus says it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. But if it was obvious that riches prevented you from going to the kingdom of heaven, or that poverty was spiritual, the disciples would be like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But instead, they're astonished, and they say, who then can be saved? Right? Why do they say who can be saved when it's about a rich man not being able to enter the kingdom of heaven? It's because in that culture, coming out of the Old Testament, viewed riches and wealth as a blessing from God. And so what Jesus is saying in that parable is that even the most blessed person you know can't get to the kingdom of God unless God enables him, right? Because what does Jesus say? With man it's impossible, with God it's possible, right? So that parable is actually playing on the cultural context at the time of this idea that riches and blessing go together, and it's actually surprising to them that a rich man can't go to heaven, or that it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle.
Sure, because like we looked at in the previous section on the Old Testament, seems that riches are a blessing from God demonstrating your faithfulness. So they almost, what you're saying is they almost had a one-to-one correlation in their mind that if you're wealthy, you're obviously faithful and godly, and therefore that's why God blessed you in these ways. Perfect. So this leads me to my next point, and this is something that I think is really important to treat. Is poverty an inherent good? Because I think a lot of Christians with this kind of sense, remember back to what I said about the private jet. Remember what I talked about Jay-Z's $100,000 night out. If your general tendency is to be like, ugh, that extravagance, that wealth, etc., that's gross, that's not good, etc., you might be tempted to feel that poverty itself is an inherent good. Okay, this exists in Christian cultures that we're obviously blessed if we don't have much money, and frankly, we shouldn't be striving for money, we shouldn't desire money, etc. There's actually a proverb, and it's interesting that it's in Proverbs because the Old Testament is so positive on wealth. There's a proverb that actually seems to speak to this idea. This is Proverbs 38, and frankly, I think a lot of Christians might try to take this proverb as their life verse, if you will. Proverbs 30, verse 8. I'll read it to you here when I get there. One more page. Proverbs 38 says, 30, verse 8 says this, "Remove far from me falsehood and lying. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is needful for me." Okay? And the idea here being, look, all I have is what I need. That's it. And this should be the attitude that I have towards wealth. I shouldn't be aspiring to gain wealth or amass wealth, and I don't want to focus on wealth at all. That's not something I need. All I need is enough money from the Lord to get by. That's it. As long as I can get by, I'm good to go, okay? And of course, here's a Bible verse that seems to support it. But I think something that is interesting here is something that Dr. Reeves says at this point. He says, some would see this as the ideal Christian verse for how a Christian should live. But let me suggest here that this proverb is not necessarily the theme verse for all Christians. This is an expression for the writer here in their particular context, in their particular situation. He says, for some people, poverty might be a legitimate option, but there are also probably some people for whom riches is a legitimate option. We need to be careful we don't take a particular verse and generalize it to all people in all situations. And the reason I'm bringing this up is I think generally, whatever view we have on wealth is the view we often think all other Christians should have on wealth. So I think Christians should be healthy, blessed, wealthy, and we should have all these finances. Well, not all Christians have that same calling, that not all Christians have that same gift from the Lord. Some of us may be blessed to have finances and have a lot of wealth. Some of us may not have finances or a lot of wealth, and all of us might be blessed by God. We all might have our particular situation in which God has placed us. I love at this quote, or at this point, a quote from John Wesley. John Wesley famously said this. He said, "Make as much as you can, save as much as you can, give as much as you can." I love that quote, right? And part of the reason I love this quote is it demonstrates a mindset of abundance. Make as much as you can, save as much as you can, give as much as you can, okay? So make, save, and give. Now, where the rubber meets the road is how much to do in what proportions, okay? Because some might say, well, yeah, make it as much as I can, but on the saving and giving as much as I can, look, I'm not as strong in those areas, right? Or what have you. But I think if we can generally have this kind of mindset towards money and finances, we will do well. It's at this point that I want to double down on this idea. Frugality should not be conflated with righteousness. Okay? Frugality should not be equated with righteousness. I don't think you can make the case biblically, and it's one of those situations that I think we have adopted this approach as a Christian culture. If you're taking notes, Proverbs 11, 24 and 25. One gives freely, yet grows all the richer. Another withholds what he should give and only suffers want. Whoever brings blessings will be enriched, and one who waters himself, he himself will be watered. Okay? You can see there's an amount of abundance here. And so frugality, being poor, poverty is not necessarily equated with righteousness. Okay? We're not all called by God to have the same amount in terms of finances, but all of us are called to steward the finances we're given well. And we all have that opportunity in our lives. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said something that I thought was interesting at this point, and it might seem to be indicating, we need to be frugal. Bonhoeffer said, earthly goods are given to be used, not to be collected. Hoarding is idolatry, end quote. But I think you can agree with that irrespective of the amount that you have. There is something to collecting goods or hoarding goods that is very self-fulfilling, self-feeding. And instead, if you are using the goods for earthly blessing, then I don't think you're falling into this trap, irrespective of how expensive the goods are. Randy Alcorn, in his book on wealth, he brings up an interesting situation. I actually think it parallels our situation here with the cleaning in the church. 1934, the Wycliffe Bible translators had a tough financial decision to make. Okay? They had to decide where they were going to hold their first training program. Okay? They had secured a rent-free barn. They could go utilize the barn for $0. Okay? Or they could spend a lavish $5 a month on a vacant farmhouse. Okay? Which option should they choose? My point is, frugality would always choose this barn, right? It's free. What are you doing? Why would you flush $5 down the drain at the farmhouse when the barn is free? It's being offered to you free of charge. Where's the mic?
I said, the barn house might not be the best place for the purpose that they were, that they had set out to do.
Right.
So, would you be able to do the best job in the barn or in the farmhouse?
Right.
That's what you have to look at, not the amount of money.
Right. And not only that, would you be able to do the best job relative to how much wealth you have to spend, right? Because let's say the farmhouse were marginally better than the barn, just barely, right? Like edged it out slightly, okay? It had better pictures on the wall, but everything
Then
else
is
was
your
the same.
money worth spending?
Correct. But if the farmhouse were largely better, then it might be worth spending. And your budget matters too. If the Wycliffe Bible translators in 1934 had a $10 budget, right? Are you going to spend 50% of your budget on just your venue? Maybe not a good choice. You're forced to be more frugal because of your budget. Whereas if they had a $1,000 budget, right? The farmhouse, even if it's marginally better, might be a no-brainer. It represents less than 1% of your overall budget to dedicate to this use. And so again, I think this is something that's very helpful to think about when it comes to these concepts or these ideas. I want to go to a parable, and I want you to actually turn there. We're going to spend a little bit of time here. I think this parable is so foundational. It's not really even a parable. It's an event that happened in Jesus' life. I think this is so foundational for us to try and get our arms around finances and what's appropriate to spend and what's not appropriate to spend. This is Mark chapter 14, verses 3 to 9. Only with the mic.
Did you have any specific New Testament verses other than the parables? When you said that the New Testament's views on wealth were more negative, did you have any specific references or places that expressed that?
So I didn't go through and grab all these verses, and again, they're on a continuum. You can find New Testament verses that seem to be neutral or even positive, right? Some people misinterpret the Ananias and Sapphira event in Acts as to be about wealth, but I think a close reading will show that's more about lying than it is about wealth and being covetousness. You can find in some of the New Testament epistles some discussions of wealth, and again, it tends to be, I wouldn't say it's overall negative, and that's, I was describing to you kind of Keith Reeves' framework, how he talks about it, but it just tends to be less focused on wealth in that sense as a blessing or prosperity from God. But I don't think any of the verses that are read negatively, I think with close exegesis can be interpreted a little bit differently, if that makes sense.
Okay,
Sure.
so it's more about separating that, wealth equals blessing from God type of idea.
Right.
That it's not a automatic thing.
yeah, I think largely what we're beginning to see in the New Testament is what I keep talking about, that as human beings, we're in different situations, and those are for all sorts of different reasons, right? Some people have greater wealth due to no fault of their own. They happen to be born into a very wealthy family, and they can utilize those finances well for God, right? Some people happen to be impoverished due to no fault of their own. They're very capable and able, but they're in a poor situation, etc. And not conflating the two and saying that you are blessed by God because you're wealthy is, I think, the more important point, right? But I think you have to take all of the biblical witness as a whole to kind of come to a solid conclusion on this, if that makes sense. If you isolate the Old Testament or you isolate the New Testament and read it maybe somewhat uncharitably, I think you can end up in a bad spot, is I guess kind of where I was going with that.
Abilities that God has given them, whether it's intelligence or whatever, which gives them the opportunity to have jobs that pay well, but not everybody would have the ability to perform that job.
Right.
And so you work at whatever you can. And I know people that make a lot of money, they have abilities that I wouldn't even attempt to do. So therefore, I could never hold a job that paid that kind of money.
Sure.
But God gave me what I could do, so you do that.
Sounds good to me, Shirley. I'm not opposed. All right, Mark chapter 14, verses 3 to 9, and this is the woman with the alabaster jar of perfume, okay? And we need to understand this situation in Jesus' life because it helps us, I think, to have a proper biblical view and a proper New Testament view, to your point, Liz, on wealth and how we should actually be viewing it, okay? So this is Mark chapter 14 and verses 3 through 9, one page earlier. And while he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at a table, a woman came in with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly. She broke the flask and poured it over his head. I've read some commentators say this is over a year's worth of wages. It's very, very costly, very precious and expensive. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, "Why was this ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor." And they scolded her. But Jesus said, "Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them. But you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her." Now, a lot can be learned from this situation in Jesus' life. There's a lot of good to be gleaned here. But I just want to focus on the wealth aspect of this parable, because that's explicitly called out. A lot of people are taking what I would call the frugal approach. They're saying, look, the value of this perfume is so high that easily the best form of stewardship for this perfume is to sell it and then utilize that money to bless the poor. And it seems obvious to them, it seems straightforward to them that this is something they should do. And even if you're not thinking in a percentage of wealth category, this is extremely expensive perfume. And let's be honest, Jesus doesn't need to be anointed with perfume in order to save the world. He doesn't require this. It's not like some sort of, his sacrifice would be null and void if he wasn't anointed. So surely it could have been done, and it wouldn't have compromised the gospel at all. So why on earth would Jesus not actually say, yeah, we should have sold this and we should have used this for the poor? And I think it's because Jesus is not frugal in the sense that I've been describing. Jesus is not always looking for what's the cheapest way to get by. And in fact, in this situation, this use of this perfume is perfectly legitimate. He honors it, he blesses it, and says, this is good. She did something extravagant and lavish. She took something extremely expensive. And so we can learn a ton from this situation, but here is one thing in particular I want us to learn. Christians can have legitimate consumptive uses for money and material goods, even for very expensive material goods, okay? Christians can have legitimate consumptive uses for material goods. even very expensive material goods, because that's exactly what happens here. She consumes it, she uses it, the jar is broken, and there's going to be, now you can't sell this for hardly anything. And she consumed it up, she used it up, and Jesus commended her. Here's the point. In any situation financially, there could be several good options. If the woman went and sold it and gave all the money to the poor, I also think Jesus would have commended her, right? Like, I think he would have been like, that's great. You did a fantastic thing, right? Both of these things are good. There's a legit way of trying to utilize the money in order to try and support people who have need, and there's also a consumptive way of utilizing an expensive good that Jesus says is fine too, okay? If you look at Jesus' life, actually, he is not very frugal in terms of his regular practice or his regular functioning, okay? Again, this is something Keith Reeves points out, but throughout his ministry, Jesus never lacked for resources, okay? He often had very wealthy people who supported him, oftentimes very wealthy women who supported him in his ministry. Not only that, if you look at Luke 7:34, he's accused of being a glutton and a drunkard, okay? I don't think if you're living a very frugal lifestyle, anyone could ever come up and say you're a glutton or a drunkard, right? Like, those don't line up. There must have been some sort of basis for calling Jesus this. Jesus is always partying, okay? He's always seen at feasts. He's always telling parables about feasts. He tells 5 different parables about banquets. He is present at 19 different meals in the Gospels collectively. 19. He's always partying. He's always out with crowds, with people. He's eating with tax collectors often. Tax collectors aren't poor, okay? Tax collectors are a lot of things. They're not poor. In fact, they're hated because they're not poor, because they're thieves, and they steal money from other people. And yet he would go eat with them. And so it's pretty clear that Jesus himself does not exemplify this overly frugal mindset that I'm talking about here. And I think what that indicates, at very least, is that if we might be called to frugality, that can't be the case for every single Christian. It can't be the case for everybody across the board, that everybody must live in this manner or have this approach, okay? Now, I want to mention something that I had mentioned last time. And I talked explicitly about virtue. And I said when it comes to stewardship of time, I think what we're really questioning often is not whether or not this time is being spent well or that time is being spent well. Instead, I think what we're often questioning is the implicit virtue of our brothers and sisters. Because we all want to live like Christ, we're all trying to live like Christ, and sometimes we suspect our brothers and sisters aren't living like Christ in certain ways in their lives, okay? And so when we're looking at these situations, we might perceive a lack of virtue in our brothers and sisters. We might suspect that they're materialistic, okay? They're materialistic. I've told people I struggle with materialism, right? That quote against hoarding from Bonhoeffer, that's something that hits me square between the eyes, right? Anybody who knows how I enjoy my hobbies and my passions knows that this is a particular struggle for me in my life. And so this is something that I think if we see extravagance or lavishness, etc., we're concerned that our brothers and sisters are materialistic. Or maybe we suspect they're spiritually lazy. Maybe we suspect they don't have their priorities straight, okay? But I want to look at 2 verses in Proverbs together here in order to look at the concept of virtue. This is Proverbs 21:17. And then I also want to look at Proverbs 21:20, okay? They're back to back, and I think it's very interesting if you contrast these verses with each other. Proverbs 21:17, and then Proverbs 21:20. Okay, Proverbs 21:17 says this: "Whoever loves pleasure will be a poor man. He who loves wine and oil will not be rich." Okay, so here you can see the materialism. It's right there. If you love pleasure, you love wine and oil, you're not going to be rich, you're going to be poor, you're essentially going to have nothing. Now look at verse 20. "Precious treasure and oil are in a wise man's dwelling, but a foolish man devours it." Okay? So notice how these are contrasts with each other. Because earlier in verse 17, if you love wine and oil, you're not going to be rich. But there in verse 20, oil is in a wise man's dwelling. He has oil. But it qualifies and it tells you why he is not described as this one who will not be rich. Why? Because he doesn't devour it like the foolish man. That's the difference. So it's not the material good itself that is problematic. Instead, it is the heart. And time again, this comes out in the Bible. The heart attitude is what is the problem. In verse 17, the individual loves wine and oil. Why? Because they love the riches, the extravagance. They love gluttony, right? They want to spend their money and live lavishly and extravagantly. And so he's consuming oil regularly, a very precious thing at the time. But in verse 20, the wise man has his oil, but he doesn't devour it. He's not actively consuming it. His heart attitude towards his oil is correct. And so because of that, he does not fall into the trap of the poor man. Why? Because he doesn't love the pleasure. That's the difference. And so again, the materialism that we're concerned about when it comes to virtue is not something that is readily or easily discerned based upon the material goods themselves. You go into the one who loves pleasure's house, you go into the one who loves wine and oil's house, they have oil. You go into the wise man's house, he has oil. How do you discern which one is materialistic and which one is not? It is through their heart attitude, which manifests itself in a fruit of gluttony. Okay, that's the difference. And that's much harder to discern than just somebody has material blessings or material good, therefore they must be materialistic. Okay, this is much harder to get at. And again, when it comes to this topic, as we're trying to navigate this together as a church, I think it behooves us to remember that we can't compel virtue in people. We can't make people to be more virtuous by dictating that they act in a certain way or a specific fashion. Okay? Forcing conformity to external norms of financial stewardship does not lead to the inside-out transformation that I talked about last time. Okay? We can't force conformity to external norms of financial stewardship and hope that's going to lead to inside-out transformation. It doesn't work that way. All right. Where are we at for time? Okay. I want to go to a topic that I think is really important while we're here in the Proverbs. And that is this. Wealth is inferior. Wealth is good. Even in the Proverbs, it's good, but it's inferior to many things. Okay? And I think this is important to get our arms around as well. The inferiority of wealth. Let's go to Proverbs 8, 10 to 11. Proverbs 8, 10 to 11. Here in Proverbs 8, 10 to 11, you have this. Take my instruction instead of silver, and knowledge rather than choice gold. Wisdom is better than jewels, and all that you may desire cannot compare with her. Here, wealth is inferior to wisdom. It states it very explicitly. If you can have wealth or wisdom, it says to have wisdom instead. Now let's skip over a chapter or two to Proverbs 10:2. Proverbs 10:2. Treasures gained by wickedness do not profit, but righteousness delivers from death. Wealth is inferior to righteousness. The Proverbs are saying, if you can gain wealth, but you're sacrificing your righteousness in the process, you don't want to do that. Don't do that. Your righteousness is more valuable, more important to you than wealth. Proverbs 16:19. Proverbs 16:19. Says this, "It is better to be of a lowly spirit with the poor than to divide the spoil with the proud." It's better to be of lowly spirit with the poor than to divide the spoil with the proud. Wealth is inferior to humility. And again, Proverbs is a very pro-wealth book, right? And yet, here are many situations in which wealth is inferior. It's inferior to wisdom, it's inferior to righteousness, and it's inferior to humility. I could go on. It's inferior to good relationships. That's Proverbs 15:17. Having good relationships is better than wealth, according to this proverb. And here's where I'm getting at, okay? Proverbs 15:16, the fear of the Lord is better than wealth. You could go on. Principally speaking, just think about this. If wealth is inferior to all of these things, principally speaking, if it is possible for us to trade our wealth to gain any of these things, we've traded up. We've made a good trade, okay? If we can spend wealth to gain wisdom, if we can spend wealth to gain righteousness, humility, or good relationships, the Bible is, I'm arguing from the negative, right? But the Bible is essentially telling us those are all good trades. We should make those trades if we can. If we can spend our wealth to gain any of these things, those are things that we should seek to gain. I asked last time, let's list out our potentially valuable uses of time. And we listed a bunch, right? We could be sleeping, we could eat, we could read our Bible, we could pray, we could do valuable work, we could exercise, we could read books, we could evangelize, we could recreate, we could spend time with family. We went on and on and on all of these valuable uses of our time. And the reason I'm bringing all of this up is, in our current context, our current situation, if we can spend money in order to gain wisdom, righteousness, humility, or good relationships, we might want to do that, okay? If we want to spend money to have somebody else clean the church, and we can instead use the time that we would have spent cleaning the church to gain wisdom, righteousness, humility, or good relationships, we ought to at least consider that that might be a good trade, okay? I'm not saying it is a good trade because, frankly, some people can build some good relationships through cleaning the church together, right? It's very valuable, okay? So if you can not spend money and gain some good relationships at the same time, that's a double win, okay? But principally speaking, I think it's very clear from the Proverbs that it is at least legitimate to consider trading wealth for any of these things because Proverbs explicitly tells us any of these things are better than wealth, right? So we should always consider that as a potentially profitable trade. Questions or comments on this? Go ahead. Oh, wait. You must use that.
So you're saying even spending money to get those, not just trading it. Like instead of doing something to gain wealth, do those, can you also spend wealth to get those?
Yes, precisely. That's exactly what I'm saying, right? So you might have a certain amount of wealth, but you can spend some of your wealth, and by doing so, it gains you wisdom. Maybe you go, you sign up for a really profitable conference or something, and you spend some time, and you glean a lot of wisdom. Like, that's money well spent because now you're wiser, Or you could spend money to develop good relationships with somebody. Stereotypical example, you'd go on a date with, your significant other. Like, you're building your relationship. That's a good use of money, right? Yeah, precisely. All of these are good uses of money. Correct. Taking the teens on the ski trip, very good use of money, okay? Because we're trading wealth to gain virtues that Proverbs says are way more valuable than wealth, okay? Perfect. Now I want to go to a topic that I think is really important because this has to do with our mindset. This has to do with our mindset surrounding wealth. And this is actually a topic that's popular in secular culture right now, but you can see plenty of biblical examples of it as well. And this is called scarcity mindset versus abundance mindset. So I want to talk about these psychologically first. Psychologically speaking, abundance mindset essentially says the world is full of possibilities. The world is full of opportunities for us. We can set big goals. We can believe the best is yet to come. Ideas, resources, tools that are available to us, they're unlimited. Okay? We can go out and we can utilize all of this stuff. And we can utilize it. Oftentimes, this will possess with itself also a passion for life, energy, zeal, etc. Okay? And so that's the idea behind an abundance mindset. A scarcity mindset essentially views life as having lack to it. People with a scarcity mindset will often think that there's not enough to go around. Okay, so there's, for example, a limited amount of pie for all the human beings to have, and we need to divvy up this pie in order to try and distribute it well. And scarcity mindset essentially says we have a fixed amount, we can't get any more than our fixed amount, and as such, we need to focus on not losing our fixed amount. The abundance mindset would say, let's just make more pie. We can just bake some more pies. Everybody can have pie. It's going to be great, right? And so these different mindsets are, like I said, they're talked about extensively in psychology right now. And what's been identified is that a scarcity mindset is actually very limiting for being able to be effective in the world. People who have a scarcity mindset also often fall victim to victimhood and victimization. They often feel like the world is happening to them. They're not in control of their destiny. They can't do anything about their circumstances or their situation. They got dealt a bad hand, and they just got a bad run of cards relative to everybody else, right? That's kind of scarcity mindset. Often tends to be focused on this is actually a bit more of a materialistic mindset, because you're focused on the achievements, the recognition, the money, and power. Instead of focusing on giving, you're focused more on like hoarding, right? Like, I've only got a little bit, so I better hold on to it, okay? Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is I actually think that you can make a strong case that an abundance mindset is more in line with what we see in the Bible, okay? I think an abundance mindset, like I said, you could talk to secular psychologists who are talking about these concepts. But if you were to ask yourself, hey, which one of these is more biblical? I actually think that an abundance mindset is more biblical, okay? If you look at Genesis 2, 8 to 14, and we won't turn there necessarily, but, and you can just look at the creation all around us. I think God creates abundantly. Okay, I think if you look at the world, it has abundance to it, just inherently. I think our God leans into abundance, okay? If you look at the world, it is full, pregnant with creatures and with, plant life and all of these different things that you go to I'm sure God has created creatures no human being has ever seen. No human being has discovered yet, right? And they're there, they exist out in nature, in the world, simply for the pleasure of him creating it. He's a God of abundance, and he creates in an abundant fashion. And I think if we take this mindset ourselves, it actually frees us and helps us to live in a manner that is more consistent with, I think, proper stewardship of wealth. Okay? If we have a scarcity mindset, and again, this is inherent, this comes from nature and nurture and a bunch of other things. If you feel like you have a scarcity mindset, not necessarily anything wrong with you, okay? But I think it's something that we want to break out of, and we want to lean into an abundance mindset, okay? If we have a scarcity mindset, we are going to act, I think, in a truncated fashion, and we're not going to be stewarding the wealth that God has given us well. Instead, I think we need to lean into an abundance mindset. A great passage on this is the one I already referenced, of the parable of the lilies in the field and the birds of the air. Jesus sees the world as full of abundance. And he says, you're so worried about the clothes you're going to wear or the food you're going to eat. But God has filled the world so abundantly with these things that animals and plants that don't think for a second about whether or not they're going to be able to feed themselves tomorrow, They have abundance. He says, you're much more important than sparrows. You're much more valuable than flowers. If God has richly blessed them, how much more is he going to give to you, right? And I think that is much more consistent with an abundance mindset. Now, I want to take a quote here I got from an article. It says this: the words of Jesus in this parable sound almost irresponsible to type A, hardworking people, okay? And I thought that was helpful, right? Because type A, hardworking people, right? Again, we want to be frugal, we want to save, we want to do a good job. I'm not denying any of that, right? But if you're not careful, a type A, hardworking mindset might lead to scarcity. And it might lead to truncating yourself and not leaning into everything that God has for you in the world. And again, I'm not talking prosperity preacher. God has a private jet for you if you just believe. That's not what I'm saying. But God is abundant, he is generous, and I think we can move from a scarcity mindset to abundant mindset. One article said that Jesus fed the 5,000 with a scarce amount of physical resources, right? And yet he managed to feed the 5,000 because he has all of the resources of the kingdom at his disposal. He is the steward of abundance, okay? A handful of passages if you want to dig into these yourself. John 10:10, I think, leans into a bit more of an abundance mindset. 1 Timothy 6:17. And then 2 Corinthians 9:6-8. But the reason I want to bring this up is these mindsets affect how we view the world, and they affect how we view what Christianity is or ought to be. But if that's happening to you implicitly and you're not deciding to view the world that way on purpose, it might actually be holding you back, and you might actually be holding more of a cultural view than a biblical view, right? Go ahead.
I just wanted to say, for me, scarcity mindset is like fear-based, and that kind of like, oh, I need to like make more money so that I can provide for my family, and it's really fear-based. And abundance mindset is a lot more of that thankfulness of like, God, thank you for providing a home with a roof over my head. Thank you for providing milk in the refrigerator. Like, it's just that contentment for what God has given you. Like you said, it's not necessarily like, oh, I have a private jet, but it's a thankfulness for what God has given you versus a fear for what if something bad happens.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's helpful. Yeah, Cody.
Can some of that kind of be like taught to you by the American culture? Because I kind of feel like that's what you learn. Oh, get a good job, put in a 401k, do this, do this, do this, do this, and you just pile on all this responsibility, and you're like, I can't do anything now because if I don't, I'm not responsible. I felt that way for years. I think that I can't make any decision to do something because you're told so much of what to do that now you're like, I don't. So I think that can kind of be just given by like an American life too.
Absolutely. Many of these things are a function of both nature and nurture. You could see your context matters too. I think a lot of people who came out of the Great Depression, for example, would easily lean into that mindset a lot more because they know what it's like to not have anything,
Right.
To do waiting in a bread line, for hours and hours to just try and feed your family, right? So.
But I think you can get in that mindset and then not have the thankful mindset because you're so focused on all that other fear-based that you can't even be thankful for the roof that you have over your head. So it kind of pushes away the other.
Absolutely. And thankfulness is a good antidote for a scarcity mindset.
One of the other big differences between these kinds of mindsets is sort of your perception of the world and your perception of what kinds of constraints actually exist. So one of the interesting things psychologists and others talk about is that, in the scarcity mindset, like lots of us assume things can't be different than they are, right? I can't do that. I'm not that kind of person. I'm not Elon Musk. I'm not the health guru. And we have all of these kind of implicit, kind of going off of what Cody was saying, we have these sort of implicit beliefs about this is what I can do, and these are things I can't do, and like I'm in this box, and these people are in that box. And the abundance mindset is really, it's about thankfulness. It's about sort of questioning those things and saying, what is God calling me to do? And maybe things can be different than they are, right? And in fact, that's what the gospel is for us spiritually. But there's a revitalization of our life in many ways. It doesn't mean that we can just do whatever we want at the drop of a hat, right? But there's this idea in the abundance mindset of sort of questioning and openness to, maybe I'm assuming I can't do something that I can, or maybe I'm assuming I'm always going to have this relationship with my child, or this is always going to have, right? You get that a lot. We talk to people of like, this is just the way it is. There's never going to be any different. And the abundance mindset is like, you know what? Actually, maybe it can be different. And especially for the Christian, right? How do I go to God and, who can do all things to actually change things that sometimes feel unchangeable?
Yeah, I think that's really good. Okay, I now want to spend the next 15 minutes or so talking about assets, because this one I want to talk about money and assets, and I just have one fundamental point I want to make about assets, and then I'm going to wrap up with 5 or so takeaways as we're, again, trying to march towards having a good approach to the church cleaning question here in our context, okay? So assets, and what I mean when I'm talking about this explicitly is our church building, right? How are we supposed to treat our church building? The real question here is use versus abuse, okay? What does that look like? Are we using the church building well? Are we abusing the church building? But you can take this to anything in your life, right? Like your own home, your own life situation, maybe the possessions that you're given. I think we all know the stereotypical person who loves their car so much they wash it every single day, right? Their focus is so much on preserving, that car and making sure it's always in tip-top condition. Fool's errand up here with the mud seasons we have, right? But you kind of have that stereotypical person that's out there doing that. And the question is, how do we get this right? What's an appropriate amount of use? What is shading into abuse? And at this point, I want us to go to Genesis 1, 26 to 31. Genesis 1, 26 to 31 is the dominion mandate, okay? Dominion mandate. And I think if you can understand the dominion principle in Genesis chapter 1, 26 to 31, you can get the use-abuse balance correct, okay? If you can understand the dominion principle, you can get the use-abuse balance correct. So Genesis 1, 26 to 31. The Bible doesn't like to lay flat when you open it to the first chapter. I'm going to only have to preach out of the Psalms from here on out. Genesis 1, 26 to 31. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made. Behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning the sixth day. Dominion is, I think, navigating the balance between use and abuse perfectly, okay? I think dominion, if you understand dominion, it navigates the balance between use and abuse perfectly, right? So if you had abuse on this far end, this is like scorched earth, okay? Have dominion, you say. All right, let's strip mine everything, right? Let's cut down all of the trees. Let's utilize all of it to its full capacity, right? It doesn't matter if animals go extinct. None of that matters because God has given us dominion over the earth, right? Well, scorched earth leads to an earth with no resources. We didn't steward it well. We're all dead, okay? That's post-apocalyptic scenario you don't want to be in, okay? But on the other side of this spectrum, the use side of this spectrum, you have, I think, the example where they're the extreme environmentalist example. We don't want to harm the earth at all. I don't know if you've heard this, but some people have the approach that human beings are actually a plague on the earth, right? Like if we would just get out of the way and stop, raping and pillaging the earth for all it's worth, then the earth would be way better off without us, right? That's that kind of approach. And I know that's an extremist approach, but it's real and it exists out there, right? And so that approach is also, I think, not in line with the Bible. We are told to have dominion. Have dominion, I think, looks like going out and getting oil out of the earth, taking metals out of the earth and utilizing them for the benefit of mankind, for human flourishing, and the benefit not only of mankind, but of the creatures that live here on the earth. That's stewarding it well. And so it's not that we don't refuse to utilize the earth's assets at all, but we also don't just do full scorched earth, okay? And I actually think, so right here is dominion. I have a metaphor, and I think I've used this from the pulpit before, but a metaphor that really helps me with this, okay? And this is essentially, if you can think of it this way, this is a jungle, right, or the wild. This is a city, just perfect, concrete and steel, right? And then here is a garden, okay? A jungle is pure chaos. It's just all wilderness. There is nothing to it that is tamed or brought to form or function. It's just allowed to run rampant, run wild, okay? Now, a city, that's like there's no wilderness in it. It's just a city. It's efficient, rigid, structured, organized, etc. But there's no I guess life in it, if that makes sense. It's cold. A garden is the best of both worlds. A garden takes the nature and seeks to exemplify it and beautify it and prune. Like when you prune a plant, you make it better, right? It's still a plant. You're leaning into like what the plant does on its own. You didn't make a plant out of metal, right? And then say like, look at my plant. No, you're leaning into the organic nature of the plant, but you pruned it. You shaped it. You made it look better. You improved it, right? To me, that's what a garden is. And that garden, I think, perfectly encapsulates the balance between order and chaos properly, and it holds it in tension. And a garden is exactly what God has for us. We started in a garden. We're going to end up in a garden, a better garden, right? We're moving from garden to garden. And to me, it captures the perfect example of dominion that we want to have. And so how does this apply to use and abuse? When it comes to the church building or any of the resources God has given you, any of the items you have or anything like that, take a dominion approach, okay? We should not allow the church building to be reduced to a jungle, okay? If the church building is reduced to a jungle, we aren't stewarding it well. It's not organized and structured enough. But it also should not be pristine, spotless, organized city, lifeless, full, no joy and no energy, no organic nature to it, right? We're aiming for a garden. The church building should be a garden. It should be lived in and organic, but also carefully cared for, okay? That's what we're looking for, I think, when it comes to stewardship of assets. When I think about this concept, I'm actually reminded of a good piece of leather, okay? If you get a good piece of leather, a leather bag or leather boots or something like that, leather is improved by getting beat up a little bit, okay? Like it gets scuffed up, there are scratches, it adds character to the leather, as long as you care for it and things like that. There was a company that I was fascinated with their bags at one point. They're called I think they're called Saddleback bags or Saddleback leather. And they would show pictures of people who had their leather bag for 15, 20, 30 years. Those bags were awesome because they had so much character and life to them. They had scratches in all the right place, but they were carefully cared for. They were pristine in terms of, they were oiled and they kept the leather supple, but at the same time, they were lived in. And those bags had a story to them, right? I bought one eventually, and then I realized I'm never going to use this bag, and then I sold it on eBay. So, but I again, struggle with materialism, right? But that, to me, navigates the balance perfectly in terms of assets and how we should steward our assets in the church, okay? We don't want the church building to devolve into a jungle, but it also should not be this, pristine, spotless city either.
I was just going to say, I still think it's important, though, to realize that if you looked at my garden versus, I don't know, my neighbor Bev's garden or something like that, there's still going to be some discrepancy there. Like, some people, their garden is very orderly and all of the things are in line. And there's other people that it's like, there's some weeds over there and that's okay. And I think that's good to just think about that in terms of the church building as well. Like, there are people that, yes, they're going to steward this church well and care for the asset and use it, but it's going to look slightly different than somebody else in their home and that kind of thing too. And we just have to have that kind of grace with each other, I think.
Right.
It's important.
These things are all subjective, right? Like, if somebody might prune a garden in a certain way, and I'm like, that place is a jungle, right? It's not pruned enough, right? So there are certainly degrees in each direction that we need to account for. Absolutely. Other thoughts? Yes, Bethany.
Andrew just made the comment, but when you share a garden with someone, you have to come to some medium ground because, yes, your idea of a beautiful garden might be more jungly, chaotic, someone's might be perfect, but at some point you have to come to some middle ground of this is how it's going to be used. I may have a different opinion how I would run my garden personally or this person, but you have to come to some middle ground in order for there to be flourishing.
Yes, I agree 100%. Liz?
Just kind of going along with that, maybe this including like different people's gifts in the church, because there are different giftings within the church that lend to what our church building looks like as it is right now.
Yes.
And when, I don't know how to explain this well. When something happens, like someone else doesn't feel like it's abuse, but maybe that person feels like it's abuse because it feels like it's an attack on what they've gifted and what they've given to the church.
Yes.
And so maybe that's that balance, like Bethany is saying, like figuring out, from both sides, like whoever was doing the abusing that maybe even didn't realize what they were doing was acting in a mean way toward, or
yes.
They have to be willing to, give a little bit and say, okay, maybe I'll put more effort in here, where the other person who feels like their gifting was not cared for or abused
Yeah, I understand.
can maybe give some grace and say, okay, maybe I shouldn't take things so personal. It wasn't like a literal attack on my being.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Absolutely. Paul?
Not to abuse the metaphor, but or analogy, but I think like the shared ideal is really important. And one of the other distinctions when it comes to gardens that we need to sort of come to an understanding of is this the kind of garden, like let's say where you grow food and you interact with it a lot, or is it a garden where it's flowers and you just look at it? Right,
Yeah.
and that I think there's a big divide about how much should things be used. And of course, even with flowers, you do some things, but there's a difference between like this is a garden that like we kind of are producing and drawing, interacting with very often, and it's kind of messy, and that's part of the shared ideal of like what is it that we're doing and how does that look. And so that's where like the kinds of use and the amount of use comes into play, as well as like taking care of it.
Yep. I love that. Okay, I want to move on now to my 5 prescriptions, if that makes sense. And I'll start with assets, since I'm going backwards, but that's what we're talking about right now. So, like I said before, I hesitate to be prescriptive, but I think I would be doing a disservice to the church if I went through all 4 of these studies and just gave a lot of ideas and theories, but I didn't actually talk about how should we practically apply this to this particular situation we find ourselves in. So, on stewardship of assets, an application of this is we should have some rules, okay? There should be some rules in the church. No rules is a jungle, okay? So there should be some rules. But, and along the lines of this, they should not be left up to everyone's interpretation, okay, what the rule is. But here's what I would say. These rules should be clearly communicated, which we have not done. There are a lot of like implicit rules in this church, or rules that you hear like behind the scenes, right? And then this is a rule that a bunch of us just kind of know, right? That we need to do away with that. We need to make our rules, whatever rules we want to adhere to, however we're going to decide to garden together, we need to come to a consensus on here's what the framework is, right? And then we need to adhere to those rules regularly, but also charitably, okay? Especially with visitors and people who, are in a situation where they're perhaps unable or find difficulty in following the rules, okay? So to me, we want to have some, we want to make them clear, and we want to then charitably but regularly adhere to them. I want to get rid of these unspoken rules that are all just kind of behind the scenes, and they're left up to different people's practices or interpretation. And then there's a mixed reception because not everybody agrees about that particular rule. Okay, well maybe we shouldn't have unspoken hidden rules. Okay, maybe we should just be more explicit about some of these, right? And I don't want a laundry list of them, right? Like if we can get a few practical rules. I had a friend at work, and he said there was one rule at a company I used to work for. I was like, what was the one rule? He said, use good judgment. That was our rule. And I was like, that's a good rule, but it's also pretty open to interpretation, right? Like, what does good judgment actually mean? So anyway, somewhere, happy medium there I think would be good. So I think that would be, again, using the garden metaphor or analogy, I think that would be doing that well. Figuring out what areas we need to have rules for and making some that we can follow, and we can follow charitably, okay? Secondly, I want to talk about the scarcity or abundance mindset, okay? And again, I'm just summarizing here. I think all of us need to do a check on ourselves of where do we land, because that's coloring how you view this whole thing in both directions, okay? I know I argued that we want to move towards an abundance mindset, but some people with an abundance mindset, right, might spend in an absolutely, wasteful fashion, okay? Oh, it's a world of abundance. It doesn't matter. What's a budget, Like, we don't want to do that, okay? Right? Cody, I resonate. All right, I resonate, buddy. So know where you land and why, and then you know your pitfalls, right? Like, I know I'm a spender. I know I tend to think it's all going to be fine, right? Like, when financial care is needed, I'm not your go-to guy, all right? But if we're being overly frugal, I could add an injection of enthusiasm, okay? So we just need to know where we start and kind of help ourselves, move into a positive space together. And again, if you have a scarcity mindset, you can work towards, seeing more of a world of possibilities, all right? So that's what I wanted to speak to there. And that's internal work. That's the virtue I was talking about. That's in here that we all have to figure out for ourselves, okay? For ourselves. Oftentimes, God will match together opposites, so that exactly happens. Yes. Now, I'm not saying that every person is right in their own way or perfectly balances their opposite. It's conceivable that somebody might be perfectly balanced on this issue and their partner is just way off the deep end, and their partner wants to meet them in the middle, but the middle is also tipping over anyway. But yes, in general, God often puts together opposites so that we can challenge each other and grow in these ways. Okay? Next, we should not rule out paying for cleaning, okay? We shouldn't rule it out because we've seen the Proverbs principle that there are many things that are better than wealth. And so if we can spend our wealth to get wisdom or righteousness and things like that, we should at least consider that paying for it might be okay. We should not rule out paying for cleaning on the grounds that we can do it ourselves. Sure we can, but there are lots of things we can do ourselves and we have limited time. If we can trade cleaning for a greater good through the use of money, then we should at least consider it as an opportunity, okay? Might not be the right decision, and again, I would make the case that many of those virtues can be developed while we clean, so that needs to be considered, but we shouldn't rule it out. It should be a live option that we can discuss, okay? However, if we do hire it out, if we are going to hire it out, we need to ensure that there is a greater good that we are gaining. If we hire out cleaning so I can sit on the couch and eat Cheetos, I have not gained, okay? I am using my money selfishly for myself. Although I could even make the case that eating Cheetos and binging Netflix, okay? Maybe that's, look, we all know that there are examples of things. You might need a break, is all I'm saying. So maybe you need to sit and eat some Cheetos. It's fine. But my point being, and I think you get it, if we're hiring out the cleaning so we can just spend all the time and effort on ourselves, right? And instead of cleaning, I can do something fruitless or meaningless or not be contributing to the kingdom at all or my own holiness or righteousness, we're doing it wrong, okay? So if we do hire it out, we need to identify the gain. Not for ourselves, but spiritually for the kingdom, okay? We need to have some sort of spiritual gain for the kingdom. Finally, if we keep it in-house, if we keep the cleaning in-house, then in what ways are we going to utilize the financial resources that we keep for the greater good, for the kingdom, etc., right? So if we keep it in-house, we now have additional finances that we're not going to spend in that way. What are we going to spend them on? We're not just going to leave them in the bank, right? We put an aggressive budget this year so that we're utilizing God's resources. Again, to go to the part of Bonhoeffer's quote that I liked, right? If I'm hoarding, that's idolatry, okay? So we don't just save our money to keep it in the bank. We want to do something with it. Well, what are we going to do with it, okay? And I'm sure there are plenty of good things we can do with it. We could support missions. We could, put on events, whatever, right? But we need to figure out what we're going to do for the kingdom with the additional finances that we keep, okay? So those things should be considered, all right? That's it. That's it for me.
Okay.
Go ahead.
On number 3,
Yes.
I don't know how many of you realize, up until this last year, we paid for cleaning.
Yep.
But here was the problem. If we're going to pay, if that would be a decision, you've got to give the person the time they need and not restrict them. That's what happened before. They were so restricted on the time and the money they were paid, they couldn't do the best job that there should be. So if we would decide as a church to pay, make sure we plan adequate time and money to do it. Otherwise in-house. And I just wanted to point that out. That was the biggest problem with our previous paying for cleaning. They were restricted on the time, and so therefore you can't do a good job if you aren't given the time to do it.
Because we were trying to target a specific dollar amount, and so they could only spend an hour or whatever it was. I understand. Yeah, that's a good point. So again, things to consider. Right? Well, one thing I asked to do alongside of all these studies is that we're trying multiple methods right now, right? We have multiple different people. We have people cleaning on volunteer basis right now. We're paying different companies to clean as one-offs and different things like that. I want us to get a sense of, what's working, what's not, all that type of stuff, and that should help inform this decision as we come to the conclusion. But these are the 2 on stewardship. So we did stewardship of time, stewardship of money and assets. Next time we're going to talk about serving. Right? Because your philosophy of serving plays a huge part into how you view the cleaning around here and what we're trying to accomplish. Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to say, too, if we do volunteer it out, I think there also needs to be some charity in the what we think of others cleaning as well. That people can do different jobs and what they think is clean might not be what somebody else thinks is clean. That there should be some charity in that too, as far as how much time you have to give. If you are volunteering and let's say you have an hour to give on a day, you didn't plan well, you didn't steward your own time well, but your 1 hour clean isn't as good as you doing a 4-hour job, that's okay that week, and that there should be some charity given for people's schedules and time as well.
Yeah, and I think that goes consistent with the comment earlier about what is a good-looking, pristine garden to one is not necessarily the same for another, right? So, very good. Liz?
I think last time someone brought up the question about, okay, but what what about when there's a need that requires like sacrifice, and how does that play into it? And so kind of mulling that idea over and thinking about stewarding time and your money, and you've talked about resources.
Yep.
Would you say that it's correct that any time, whether it's in your personal life or relating specifically to cleaning, whenever there's a need, you look at what resources you have available to you? And so maybe like for cleaning, those resources are people, those resources are time. At this point in time for our church, the resources also the finances to hire it out. So you have like 3 options for your resources, and then you have to basically like narrow down which is the best option right now.
Yes.
And that could change over time, and that's how you make that determination. Like anytime there's a need, it might be more sacrificial for some, you know, where like someone might rather choose their time to spend or the people, but others would rather spend their money. But you still have to go back to what resources you have and then make a determination from what you have available to you.
Yeah, I agree 100%. That reminds me of the Wycliffe Bible translators that I brought up, right? If they only have $10, they probably shouldn't spend $5 on the venue. They should probably take the free barn house because they don't have financial resources to spend. They can't spare those. But if they have $1,000 in their budget, the $5 might be trivial to put on this event. So they should consider that as a resource. So I 100% agree with that, right? You know, and I think that's true for our church. I've said many times, right, that my salary should be considered to be one that can be eliminated if the church got in a situation where we were in a financial bind, right? Like I would hate that if we were financially in a very poor spot for us to be pulling funding to missionaries while I continue to collect my paycheck, because like I said, I'm in a situation where I don't need the money the church gives, right? And so we should always consider that, always. And yes, I do think we're in a situation right now where, financially speaking, we're better off than we've ever been, and so that should be considered a resource, right? Like, again, it's a live option. You know, what we decide to do is going to be based upon, you know, discussion, consensus, vote, all that type of stuff. But absolutely, that is a live option. It is a resource that we can utilize right now. So, yeah.
I think that very often we're all sort of, just our natural tendency is to be like, oh, there's a need. It has to be people.
Right.
You know, that it always has to be more, we just lend that way. Someone needs to do it, so I have to do it, versus
Right.
someone has to do it. Okay, I don't have time, maybe can I pay someone to do it? Type of idea.
Sure, absolutely.
That's just a default
Yep.
mode that we go to.
And especially, again, I think it'd be hard on a week-to-week basis to ensure that this were happening. But if we were somehow able to utilize the time that we were to save by spending the money, and we could ensure that all of us, like if I could snap my fingers, and by spending that money, all of us grew in righteousness, humility, and holiness by saving, you know, by paying somebody to spend money, I make that trade all day long, right? Like that is a win. According to Proverbs, you know, if I can trade money for righteousness and you know, sanctification, then I should be doing that, you know? So, yeah, but though, again, those are some of the conversations that need to be had.
This might not be relevant for this one, but I think it's also like in considering your resources, like who your people are, and realizing that at this point in time in our church, I think it's really unique. Every single family in our church is homeschooling. And so that extra time gained, you know, for that 3 hours, yes, I could take, you know, maybe you could bring your kids here and teach them certain things by cleaning at church, but also even, you know, for a mom or the family to spend that 3 hours together where mom is also not working, like to complete a task, could be beneficial in one of those areas.
Absolutely, yeah. And again, I'll go back to what I said last time when we talked about time explicitly. If we are cleaning the church to the exclusion of our personal time with the Lord or our time spent together with our family, the core essentials of our Christian faith, if those are being neglected in order to come clean the church, we're doing it backwards. We're absolutely doing it backwards, right? And again, on a household-by-household basis, that might be different, but we can't be neglecting the essentials of our faith: prayer, study of the Word, time together with family, you know, family devotion, all that. We can't be neglecting those in order to make sure that, you know, our assets are in good shape. We can do both, right? Like, it's like I talked about last time. You tithe mint, dill, and cumin. You should have done those, But you should have paid attention to more weightier matters of the law as well, right? Righteousness and justice and mercy, right? Do those without neglecting the former, okay? And if we're in a situation where we have the resources, we should try to do both, right? So, yeah. Anybody else? Yep, Bethany.
I don't know if I'm going to say this clearly. I was just, how do you balance that then? Like how Liz was saying, like the stewardship of like money, time, what was the other one? People, money, time, people. When you, sorry, when that's different for each person in like different stages of life. Like for some person in stage of life, they may not be able to physically clean, but maybe their job or whatever allows them to have money to give that. Versus someone else maybe in a situation where they don't have the financial means to give, but in they're looking at it, they're like, well, I can give my time. Kind of like the widow's mite. Like,
Yeah, absolutely.
that idea of like, okay, I can't give financially, but
Right.
hey, I can give my time. I can give this, or and that's going to look so different for each family, like at different seasons, at different stages. And so, how do you go about taking those, like the people, the time, the financial, and saying, okay, for one person, that idea of giving that time is so burdensome. Like they would much rather slap down $5,000.
Right.
Because that idea of the time spent is so burdensome. But for another person, thinking of it financially or thinking of it, like,
Yeah.
and I guess that's what you're going through. Like, we're all coming at it from such different points that how do you, I guess you could come and say, okay, everyone, we vote on that, but
Sure.
I'm just curious your thoughts, like, how do you get all of those nuances and come up with something that doesn't seem wasteful to somebody or burdensome to another? Because like you said, the whole virtue is like we can't by nature be like, well, we can do this, so we should be doing something else that's really selfish in whatever area.
Right. So what I would say is that, to me, all of those things need to be considered, and that's why I'm trying to do the philosophy series to show that we're coming at things from a different angle. But when it comes to making the decision itself, we're making it collectively as the church. And so we have a collective pool of time, we have a collective pool of finances, etc. I might personally be more well-off financially or less well-off financially than others in the church, but we're making the decision as a church as a whole, right? I might have more time to spend or less time to spend than others in the church, but we're making the decision of what to do with our time with the church as a whole. So you kind of have to think on two levels. You have to understand, like, okay, this is my perspective and where I'm coming from in life and what I have to give or offer, but as a church, we collectively have these things to offer. And so I understand I have this perspective. That makes perfect sense given my situation, but given our situation, the picture might look a little different, right? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
to go on that, I think like part of the way I conceptualize it is thinking about, all right, if we could spend $90, let's say it's 90 for a week. So on a given week, we can spend $90 and we can give this family an extra 3 hours of time. Is that a good trade? And then the next week, if we can spend $90 to give this family 3 extra hours of time, is that a good trade? Now, it varies by family, right, in terms of like how valuable that time is and what they're doing, and some maybe will use it better some weeks and some not as well others. But like when I think about it, it's sort of, it's not just like, okay, if we divvy up, like we each serve, 6 or 12 or 15 hours a year, and then we have like the $5,000 budget or whatever for the whole year. But each week we want to be thinking about what are we getting if we spend, again, I just picked 90, maybe it's more on this list, but we pick that number and say, okay, do we think there's a lot of value to be had for some families, for most families, maybe for all families, if we can actually trade some of the church's money to give them an extra 3 hours to do whatever? It could be shoveling someone's sidewalk, it could be homeschooling, it could be, so it's hard to kind of quantify because it's going to look really different, but that's kind of how I think about it, of like in our church, when we look at families and we're thinking about how we're going through life together, how are we doing on our time management, right? Are we feeling pretty good, like we have lots of time? Or the sense I feel personally, but the sense I have with a lot of people, especially with young kids, is like, there's a lot going on, right? Like, there's always stuff to do in terms of cleaning and teaching. And so, again, this is kind of how I think about it. I think we want to think, like, each week, what are we getting if we hire someone to clean? And there might be some other benefits too, right, in terms of who we pay and maybe consistency and maybe just ease in terms of no one has to really schedule it. But that's kind of how I think about it as an economist, is like, okay, what are we getting just each week, and is that a good trade-off, just to kind of take that quantity of money and think about what, this family is getting 3 hours, and the next week this family is getting 3 hours, just, again, to be using numbers here. Yes.
Yeah. 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 No, absolutely, and that's why I want to have all these conversations and discussions, right? Because, again, this is what I said in the original email, is I believe this is a fantastic opportunity for us to discuss these philosophies, because we all come to the Christian faith with this in our background. We all kind of have intuitive ways of thinking about these concepts, but I don't think we often sit down and explicitly walk through them and what are the principles that lie behind them and all that type of stuff. And I am not hoping that by the end of this, we're all on the same page and we all just agree. But what I am hoping is we all can see each other's perspective a little bit more, and then as we come to a consensus, we all feel better about it, and we feel like, oh, I can see why we're doing this as a church, and I feel good about it, or even if I don't feel good, I can understand it, right? That's kind of what I'm hoping for. So anyway, halfway through. I want to respect our babysitter's time. I'm going to pray for us, and then, like I said, halfway through, we got 2 more to go before end of March. Father God, we thank you so much for your grace and mercy. Please guide and direct our steps as a church as we seek to understand all of these things, what exactly we should be doing, and how we should steward these things well. Please teach us and help us to love you, to live for you, to glorify and honor you in all that we do. We thank you for your grace and mercy, and we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. I'm going to turn off the stream.